Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Liz Stewing. I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Manager here at Violence Free Colorado. And I have to say that I am really excited about this topic today. I think that talking about staff burnout and turnover is such an important topic. It's something that has definitely affected me personally as an advocate and as somebody who hired and supervised advocates in domestic violence programs. And I think it's something that, can benefit a lot from us even just starting the conversation within our organizations and within our communities. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. I'll start off by saying if anybody has questions or anything as we go along the way, please feel free to pop them in the chat box. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. I'm also happy to answer questions at the end. And also, we are recording this today. And so at the end, we'll be able to send out this recording and the materials that we talk about in here so that you have them, so that you can share them with other folks who you think might benefit from them. So we have a couple of different learning objectives today. So our goal for our hour we have together is to talk about some of the causes of employee turnover and how they apply to domestic violence field and really the human services field in general. We're going to talk about recognizing signs of burnout and secondary trauma. We're going to talk about skills that can help you have conversations with your staff, and I have a really wonderful resource to share with you to help you start some of those conversations. And we're going to discuss implementing the accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed principles in their agencies and how that relates to reducing staff burnout and turnover. So I debated whether to even put this slide in here, but this is my slide to say that turnover, heavy turnover, right? There's obviously always going to be some natural turnover. Folks are going to move with their families or move on up in their career, other things. So some turnover is absolutely healthy and normal for an organization, but heavy amounts of turnover, which is going to look different depending on the size of the organization, but large amounts of turnover have a really detrimental impact on an organization's ability to execute its work. When you have to spend all of your time training and supporting new staff, that makes it really difficult to move forward with other goals. And so these are just some general statistics. These relate to employment overall, not specifically domestic violence or nonprofit work. But I think one of the really telling statistics here is that 87% of employers said that improving retention is a critical priority. I'm dying to know who that other 13% is that's not a priority for them. So we know now that this is really something that is impacting both the nonprofit sector, domestic violence and sexual assault programs, but also the industries and business as a whole. And so these are just some things you can think about, but also to remember that you're not alone in this, that if you have really been struggling with burnout and turnover, that you're not alone. Another statistic in here that kind of blew my mind was the 50 to 60% of an employee's annual salary is the direct cost of replacing that employee. That is a tremendous cost, especially when we're thinking of our programs that may have less than 10 advocates. When you're thinking about that cost, that's a heavy burden to bear. So we hopefully want to give you some strategies to help you navigate that and reduce that as much as possible. So what causes turnover? So these are a combination of things that come from nonprofit industry resources and research, and also of things that we see in our Colorado Domestic Violence Needs Assessment survey from 2018, and just our work here at the Coalition from what we're hearing from programs. So big causes of turnover are organizational culture, supervision practices, lack of leadership or development opportunities, overwork and or boredom, and lack of clarity around duties. So we're going to go through each of these individually. So organizational culture. This is one of the bigger factors in turnover and burnout, and it's also one of the most difficult to address, right? So organizational culture can be impacted negatively when you have significant disruption between people. You know, disagreements and things like that are completely normal amongst staff, but this is significant ongoing disruption that isn't being resolved or addressed, can really negatively impact people's experiences in their workplace. Being caught with supervisors with different expectations, or some this happens between somebody's direct supervisor and the executive director, that kind of lack of really understanding who they're reporting to and what their priorities are, and what to do if those priorities are in conflict with each other. And if that's happening to several people in the agency, it can really impact organizational culture. Conversations, you know, conversations that don't have a clear outcome or clear path forward. Having difficult conversations is just a part of our work. Nobody on this call is a stranger to having challenging conversations within their agencies. And so that is not necessarily creating a negative organizational culture. It's that lack of next steps, lack of follow through, lack of really listening and believing to the issues and believing that they need to be addressed. And then that leads right into advocates not feeling like their input is valued. And that can really impact how people see the organization as a whole and their role within it. So supervision practices can lead to turnover because this is where an employee has the most traction and experience with the organization, right? They are most likely to interact most frequently with their supervisor, and their supervisor is also where a lot of the challenging things that come in, performance evaluations, challenges and learning opportunities and things like that, those tend to come from a supervisor. So the supervisor's practices are really important in reducing turnover and burnout. And this idea of reflective supervision, if you haven't heard of that, I've got a bunch of resources in here. And this is really just a supervision practice. Actually, I'm going to flip to the next slide. That allows folks to process. And so reflective supervision has, you know, some pretty significant research and social science behind it for all organizations, but is shown to be especially effective in people who are working in fields where they are working with survivors of trauma. So this idea that, that an employee has an event or experience, and then they're able to explore their thoughts and feelings about that experience with their supervisor in a regular supervision meeting. The supervisor is able to address perspectives that the employee might have about their feelings, is able to give constructive feedback, is able to give support, and then that supervisor and that employee are able to partner together for solutions. And so that is a supervision tactic that really demonstrates how supervisory practices can have a really big impact on a person's experiences within an organization. This is also where supervision is also where a lot of trust is built. You know, employees are able to work through challenging situations within an organization a lot better if they have that established basis of trust with that organization. It allows to process and reduces the impacts of secondary trauma, creates a regular feedback process, right? So getting feedback is challenging for humans. You know, it's just something that's hard. And I know, you know, every year when performance evaluations roll around, even if you think you're doing a great job, they're still kind of nerve-wracking. And so when you're creating an expected outcome of supervision is that you're going to be getting feedback, whether that's formal written feedback or just, you know, a conversation about feedback. When you're getting that feedback, staff and employees can learn how to better absorb and better take in and better listen to that feedback. And also, if you're giving regular feedback that is both positive and negative, and you're kind of developing that skill of being able to receive feedback, when you have to have a really challenging conversation with somebody, you already have that basis of understanding that they've participated in this feedback process before. And we can name it, right? We can say like that being able to receive and understand and incorporate feedback into our work is a skill. And it's not something that we get taught anywhere in particular. And so some people are great at it and some people aren't. And that's okay because it's a teachable skill. And it's something that you could work on in supervision. It's also really wonderful because that being able to process feedback can help improve advocates' experiences with survivors, right? Survivors are constantly giving us feedback in a lot of ways. And sometimes they're giving us feedback in challenging ways because of what they're experiencing and what they're going through. And so again, if we have that practice, if we build up that skill, that can help us in challenging direct service situations as well. So providing leadership opportunities, and really leadership, I think the first thing folks tend to think about is positional leadership, which is promotion, becoming a supervisor, those kinds of things, which could absolutely be a part of it, right? If employees feel like there is potential for them to have some positional leadership within an organization, that can help them reduce turnover because they see a future for themselves with the organization. But when we're thinking about a lot of programs across the state of Colorado, a lot of them are smaller programs, right? So if you've only got a staff of 5 or 6, those positional leadership roles might be harder to come by. And also sometimes the skills of advocacy don't necessarily translate into that kind of like positional, official type leadership positions. And sometimes that's not what folks want. So there are other ways that we can promote somebody's leadership and professional development that doesn't have to be positional. And that can help us retain employees by helping them learn and grow and continue to grow in their career, even if they're staying in the same position they are currently in. So some temporary and situational leadership opportunities that you could give people: leading a committee, right? So if you've got something challenging going on within your organization and you're creating some kind of short-term committee to deal with it, letting a staff person who maybe doesn't have positional leadership take on that role could be a great learning opportunity. Consulting with folks on a process. If you've got a staff person who has, a background in mental health services, and you're talking about improving your process for mental health referrals, and you go to that staff person and ask them to consult, to review the process and meaningfully incorporate their feedback, that can give folks a real sense of value and purpose and support within the organization. And then sometimes temporary things can also be representing the organization in the community, right? So do you have community meetings, boards, other organizations where you are representing or you are providing a perspective on domestic violence and sexual assault services? Is there somebody in your organization that you can provide support and training to so they could be able to be that representative in the community? That can be a great opportunity for folks to develop their skills. And then when we're thinking about skills, support can also look at really developing those career skills. What training or experience would that person like to have in their career? And this is another really good argument for having regular and consistent supervision between supervisor and staff person, is that you can have these discussions about, what would you like to learn? Where would you like to grow? These could also be skills that are identified by the supervisor as needing some development. Maybe somebody really struggles with answering hotline calls, or whatever particular skill you want somebody to grow in. Offering additional training and experience can be a great way, and framing it in a way that it feels like you're investing into them as a person and as an advocate can help reduce that turnover because they feel like they're being valued within the agency. Letting people use their skills that may not be directly related to advocacy services, but that are a meaningful part of their life, can really provide a lot of value for an employee. So I put on here teaching yoga, right? So, if you have somebody on your staff who teaches yoga in their free time, maybe they can, do a free class for the staff or something like that. That's just an example, but folks are happier in their work when they can show up as their full selves, right? They can be their true and authentic selves as much as possible in the workforce. So maybe investing in some time and or training for somebody to be able to utilize a skill that's valuable to them could provide that for them. And I think that constant kind of checking in with the staff person's development really shows that investment in that person in the long term. And that helps folks see themselves in an organization long term and can reduce turnover. So overwork and or boredom. In my experience, these tend to coexist in the same thing. And I think that folks who are providing crisis services to folks who've experienced domestic violence or sexual assault, that they actually have one of the biggest challenges of this, right? Because we have no control over when that phone rings, when survivors are wanting to meet with advocates, what's going on. It really ebbs and flows. And so this is a big challenge. And I could probably, do a whole webinar just about this. But there are some ways that you can kind of gauge folks to make sure that they are not feeling like it's either feast or famine, that they're so overwhelmed that by calls and tasks that they have to do that they can barely function, and or they have so little to do, they don't even know what to do with themselves. So again, you're going to hear me say this a lot, regular supervision, asking folks, what's your week look like? What challenges are you facing this week? What are you working on? Those kinds of things can really help kind of catch those issues early before somebody is perpetually in a state of overwork and or boredom. A job description, like a clear, honest and authentic job description can be really helpful in these scenarios because it's a touchstone. The employee and the supervisor can sit down together, go back to that job description and see what things can be pulled back or what things can be added to help make that workload seem a little bit more manageable. And utilize the data that you have, right? If you are using Salesforce Cafe system or some other sort of Apricot or any of those other kind of data tracking systems, if you're able to pull reports by staff person, and that's something that I could help you with, or Chelsea at DVP, who's a cafe wizard, could help you with kind of getting that information if that's possible for how you're tracking. That can be really helpful, right? So, if you are looking at these reports and you're seeing that one staff person is having 240 client contacts in a year, and another person is having less than 50, for example, that might need to be a conversation that you're having with that workload. And overwork and boredom aren't just issues for one individual staff person. If other staff are perceiving that some folks have more work or less work, that's going to negatively impact your organizational culture. So going back to that first reason that people leave organizations is that organizational culture. So being aware of kind of what's happening to the greatest extent that you can is a great way to kind of cut things off before they get too bad. And also looking at the kinds of tasks that somebody is doing, right? If there is one person on your staff that is taking all of the calls that involve somebody who is, maybe dealing with suicide or other issues, and then one person is, taking more of the calls that are just, information and referral type things, that could be impacting both of those staff members negatively. So, is there somebody who is kind of the go-to for difficult situations, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? There's a very good reason to lean on your advocates who have a lot of experience in the field. But when you're doing that, you also want to be pulling back in other areas so that person's not feeling overworked. It's also a good way to check and see if that, sometimes staff people, they have things that I know I definitely have been in this situation myself, is where I've had things, tasks or situations that make me really nervous or uncomfortable. And so I would let other folks step in and deal with them if they are more comfortable with this, which isn't always bad, again, but it's one of those things you want to check and make sure. If there's something that an employee is consistently avoiding doing, really investing in that training and or support and something to get them a little bit more comfortable with that is not only going to help kind of balance that work across the staff, but that's also going to develop those skills and resources of that individual staff person, and that could help really reduce your turnover in kind of two different ways there. So lack of clarity around duties. Again, I think this is such a big challenge for folks who work in domestic violence and sexual assault because we have to do so much, right? We have to be able to help and support survivors with so many different things. It's not enough that you just, are great with housing, but you also have to be able to safety plan around housing, and you have to be able to do all of these different things. And so every advocate is going to wear a lot of different hats, and that's okay, and that's normal, I think. But we need to, and this is where, if you joined us for the hiring practices one, I really focused a lot on your job description. And I think that is a really key piece of building a solid foundation for an employee. And so when your job description will, of course, other duties as assigned, that's just the nature of nonprofit work. But when those other duties as assigned are just a small percentage of our work, and most of our work is clearly laid out in the expectations of that job, that's really going to help that person, right? So if a person, gets a job and the title of the job is hotline advocate, for example, but nearly 50% of their work is data entry, if we're not upfront about that, originally when we're hiring, that's going to lead to some negative feelings for that person. And so that kind of lack of clarity around duties can be really eliminated by having a really great job description that you evaluate every time you have to repost that to make sure it's really accurate to what your grant requirements are for that position and what the realities of the work are for that position. But then there's kind of another, so that's lack of clarity around like an individual employee's job duties. There's also lack of clarity around kind of this idea of chain of command or where leadership goes. And so really it's about knowing who you have to talk to in a challenging situation and when you have to seek support of a supervisor. And I think this can be a big challenge for a lot of employees. And another thing that can help build longevity, if somebody knows how and when they need to involve their supervisor, that's going to reduce a lot of stress and anxiety for them and potentially reduce a lot of extra work for that supervisor. We want to be able to empower advocates to have, as much kind of autonomy and authority within their work as possible, because that allows them to really be leaders in their work, not really overflows to survivors, right? But absolutely, there are things in this field that require a supervisor's input, advice, or just kind of approval. And so being very clear what those paths are can be really helpful. Also preparing for emergency situations ahead of time, making sure that your policies are really clear, making sure that folks know what to do in the situation, doing a dry run of a situation so that, if it's, whether it's fire evacuation, so everybody knows what spot on the next block that they're supposed to meet if a shelter gets evacuated for a fire, whatever those little things are, right? So that kind of lack of idea of what to do can cause a lot of stress and anxiety for employees. And sometimes folks will walk away from that, right? So if things are too confusing, too hard, if they're spending, a good chunk of their time trying to figure out who they need to talk to in the organization or getting information or getting, small things approved all the time, that's not what they signed up for, right? Folks don't go into advocacy to get rich, obviously. Folks go into advocacy because they want to help folks. And so whatever we can do to kind of reduce some of those organizational and structural barriers to make sure that folks know how to do their job and can do it quickly and clearly, that will reduce some of that turnover because folks won't have to walk away from that situation. And again, how are you demonstrating the link between what the person is doing and the organization's goals and values? We are here because we want to support and help survivors. And so whenever we can make that connection for folks, that can be a really powerful way to help folks stay connected to that passion and mission. And there's a lot of research that's been coming out in the last couple of years about the millennial generation and how vital it is that they feel that connection to the mission and goal of an organization, that they're very values driven in the work. And so they're able to be really flexible and do a lot of different kinds of tasks within a job if they can be linked back to that mission and values. And so that's a great, in your job description, in your supervision, all of those things, just really kind of hitting on that note, are you connecting it to your organization's values? So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of the link and overlap between burnout and secondary trauma. And so these are both phrases, words that get used interchangeably sometimes. And so I think that they can happen at the same time and they can happen separately and individually, right? So burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands. So burnout happens in fields across every discipline, whether or not it involves working directly with folks who've experienced trauma. So burnout is kind of this larger idea, and it is very real. And it's connected to secondary trauma because sometimes they come hand in hand, or one can cause the other. So secondary trauma, it's called compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. There's a lot of different words for it, but what the idea is that a person is having indirect exposure through first-hand account or narrative of trauma. And so that describes exactly what advocates do. And secondary trauma can happen without burnout happening. Secondary trauma is often, something frequently that we're absorbing in our work. And it's a challenge, but if we can deal with it, if we can process it, if we can get support for it, it may not necessarily lead to burnout. And so that's kind of the connection between the two. But I think that, what I've heard from survivors, what we've heard in assessments across the state, my own experience in this work, is that the secondary trauma led me towards burnout. And the lack of support around really processing and dealing with that secondary trauma caused the state of burnout where I felt overwhelmed and unable to meet the constant demands of my job. And so we want to just think about how and when. They are probably things, that you will face in your organization, both independently and together at times. So here's this, again, this is for employment broadly. This is not necessarily narrowed down to human services or even domestic violence services, but employee burnout broadly. Employees who say that they are very often or always experience burnout at work are 63% more likely to take a sick day, half as likely to discuss how to approach performance goals with a manager, 23% more likely to visit the emergency room, 2.6 times as likely to leave their current employer as somebody who's not experiencing burnout, and 13% less confidence in their performance. So these are meaningful implications in somebody's day-to-day life, right? I mean, you think about 23% more likely to visit an emergency room. That is significant impact on somebody's personal life and somebody's work life. And so burnout is something that is really important and has really big impacts on people. But this second point here kind of gets to the idea of that it's also something very hard to pinpoint and to work on, because folks are half as likely to discuss how to approach performance goals with their manager. And in my experience, this expands to talking about burnout with their manager. You know, sometimes people don't feel comfortable sharing those things because they're afraid that their supervisor will see them as, you know, not willing to do the work or not doing the work correctly, or will have some sort of negative impact on their job performance if they talk about burnout. Also, it's something you can't always recognize when it's happening. And again, that's the power of having regular supervision. You know, somebody who's having frequent and constant interaction with a staff person is more likely to be able to spot some of these issues and signs of burnout and be able to address them sooner. And so this is why we say talk about it before it's happening, right? Because folks are not always going to disclose to you that they're experiencing this. Honestly, folks are much more likely just to quit and never tell you why, because of their experiences, and because this burnout is often coupled with secondary trauma, and that makes it very difficult to talk about, especially if they're not used to other folks in the workplace talking about it. And you know, if somebody hasn't been working in the field of domestic violence or sexual assault for a while, it's probably unlikely that folks are talking to them about secondary trauma. I mean, even in our field, when we think about talking about it regularly, the impact on staff, you know, that's not even, you know, that long term of a practice. And so it's something that we really need to invest in, so that we are not just noticing problems when people are walking out the door, and it's too late to do anything about it. So this is one of the most valuable resources I have ever come across. In fact, I was rereading the book this week in preparation for this webinar, and you know, it's been about probably 4 or 5 years since I read it, and like every page I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot how incredible this book is. So this book is called Trauma Stewardship, and it is a very practical and solutions-based guide for folks who are working with people in trauma. And I think that it has a lot of the most creative and practical strategies of anything I've come across. And in fact, it has some personal plan information in it so that somebody could read through and kind of understand their own experiences and put a plan to ask for and receive help around those. And after I started reading it this week, I was like, I need to do a new plan for myself. And I actually started using the kind of the workbook section all over again, and it's wonderful. And so this is a quote from the book, that if we're going to do work with suffering people and environments in a sustainable way, we must understand how the work affects us. And I think this is vitally important to making work in this field sustainable, and something that folks want to continue to do. And that's focusing on that sustainability and that impact on somebody can really help reduce the turnover, because it will reduce the burnout that somebody is experiencing. Also, I believe that the author was in Colorado maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was before my time here at the Coalition, but books were purchased for, I think, most of the programs in the state. So check your office. There might be a copy of this book floating around, but it's also a pretty low-cost book. This would be a great way to invest in getting this book that you can share around your office for folks to kind of dig into this topic. It's also helpful for, you know, you can't just bring something up for the first time in a supervision or in a staff meeting and have folks necessarily be ready to talk about it. But if you were wanting to start having regular dialogue about secondary trauma and burnout, this would be a great, you know, book club, or, you know, have a chapter that folks can read to give folks time to kind of think and process about it before they're doing so in a group setting. I find that gets much better participation and discussion. So these are in a combination from the Trauma Stewardship book, and then also a couple of other things that we have had reported to us here at Violence Free Colorado. So these are signs of burnout and or traumatic exposure response. And so these are things that can happen to somebody when they are feeling overwhelmed by the secondary trauma that they're receiving from the survivors that they're working with. And I can say that I've seen all of these in my time supervising staff. I don't think that I always fully connected them to the secondary trauma experiences. So I think it's important to think about these things, and it can help us, it's not that we need to allow negative or inappropriate behavior happen in the workplace, but if it does happen or if it's getting ready to happen, it's how we respond to it. And so responding to it from this idea of secondary trauma can help us really eliminate and reduce that kind of behavior, and can also help us help our staff have better experiences in their day-to-day work. And that is really valuable. When somebody can go to work most days, feel like they're making a difference in the world, and feel like they have the support that they need, that even if things get really busy or overwhelming, that they're still going to have support and respect, that can go a long way. And another thing, we're thinking of millennials who are fast becoming a large part of the workforce, is that a lot of research and articles have been coming out about that millennials are actually willing to make a lot less money if they have the kind of workplace support and benefits that improve their quality of life. So this is another way to think about that, especially if you've got millennials on your staff, working on this can in a different way for that generation. For a lot of folks from that generation, can help address that burnout and turnover. And so these things can also show up in our work with survivors. My background is as a shelter manager, and I think that at times when I was really dealing with a lot of secondary trauma, that hypervigilance here on this list was something that I experienced a lot. I remember just being very aware and overwhelmed of what dangerous things might be happening, which is of course natural and an important part of our work, but up to an extent, right? I didn't need to watch every car that went by on the street, and those other negative behaviors that came from the fact that I was being hyper vigilant because I had secondary trauma that I wasn't processing. And so again, if we're thinking about we want to do the best job we possibly can with the folks that we're serving, addressing the secondary trauma within staff can reduce a lot of these behaviors that could either directly or indirectly impact a survivor's experience in our programs. A couple of other ones that I think are really common is this idea of minimizing. And when you work every day and you hear a lot of the terrible things that people have experienced, it's really easy to say, oh, my problems aren't so bad. At least I wasn't, I wasn't in a situation where I was in physical danger, or, at least I have a roof over my head, or at least I have this. So I think that folks who work with survivors can minimize their own struggles because the folks they're working with are struggling so much as well. And supervision and staff support is a way that we can help them really understand that it's not an either or. The survivors you work with are absolutely struggling and dealing with really awful things, and you can be struggling as well, creating that room for humanity and balance. But that minimizing is something to look out for, and could be a warning sign to help you have some early conversations with somebody to make sure that this behavior doesn't really negatively impact themselves. So some of the other things, cynicism, right? I mean, that can be, and of course, it's a different scale for everybody has their own kind of scale of cynicism, but being more cynical than they are naturally can be a sign that somebody is struggling in their work. Inability to empathize, sometimes When you've experienced a lot of negative behavior from a survivor, it can be hard to really, in that moment, empathize with them and the trauma that they're experiencing because they are causing you to feel unsafe and things like that. So it's a good, kind of lack of empathy, if that's something you're noticing is changed in a person, that can be another red flag. And again, these signs of burnout and trauma are not just helpful for supervisors to know and be aware of, but they can also be something that can be information that can be helpful for the staff. And so in that trauma stewardship book, there is more information about each of these. And it was really enlightening for me to just read through and think, oh, yeah, I have been, feeling a little guilty because I can do all of the things I wanted to do to support survivors in programs. And so it allows for that self-reflection and can build that self-reflection skill within people. Again, we are not, generally trained in our lives to be reflective of our own behaviors and experiences. So this is another great skill that you can teach that will help the staff person feel better in their work. And it's another skill that then translates into their advocacy work as well. Because, helping and being supportive of survivors when they're processing, when they're learning about themselves, those things can be helpful advocacy skills as well. So it's kind of a double bonus. Avoidance, I think this is a big one we see, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. If you see somebody avoiding a particular task in dramatic ways, that can really be a sign that there's something about that task that is really challenging somebody. And in my experience, it's not that the task is challenging, it's that there is a memory or a secondary trauma or something related to their experience that is impacting them. And the additional layer that we have to think about in our field is that so many of our advocates are survivors themselves. So not only is their work sometimes involved secondary trauma, a lot of folks have primary trauma as well. And so these things may impact them more severely, or there may be certain types of survivors or certain survivor experiences that really trigger some of these things. So again, that self-awareness can be so powerful in an advocate's work as they're supporting survivors. So how do we talk about this? We've talked about some of this. So a lot of this work really comes down to supervisors. And I also think that executive directors, if it's in an organization that's big enough where there's supervisors in between the executive director and staff folks, that executive director is often really seen as that leader within that organization. And so when supervisors and other leadership in the organization, even board members, when they're normalizing and supporting this work and saying that, this is secondary trauma happens, it's part of our work, but we want to support you in that. When you're really truly saying that and living that, that can be a really powerful model for the entire staff. Something that we can do to support staff is be curious when something happens. So if we notice an avoidance behavior within a staff person, instead of immediately thinking, here's how I'm going to fix it, or here's how I'm going to tell them how they're doing something wrong, we start with curiosity. What's going on with this, and what kind of support does somebody need to be successful in that task? And that doesn't mean it might get to a point where, if that task is a crucial part of that work, that this person can't continue in this position. That absolutely happens sometimes. But if we start being curious before it becomes a crisis, we can build in better support for the staff before it gets to that point. So self-care, right? Big buzzword. It's everywhere. It's really important. And I think that a lot of times programs can struggle with self-care because self-care can be so individual, right? So, something that is self-care for one person may not be self-care for another person, and that's totally okay. So really what our role as supervisors or leaders within the organization can be is to, model our own self-care behavior, to share resources, and say, here are some things that work for other people, here are some common things, and kind of do that. And then that ties back to that self-awareness, right? If we're really promoting that skill within staff during supervision, asking them to, explore some of their emotions and feelings, that's going to translate really well to self-care, because that first step of self-care is always awareness of what it is that you need so you can provide that for yourself. So instead of saying, everybody needs to go home and take a bubble bath, right? What we're saying is that everybody needs to be curious about what helps them, what supports them, what makes them feel better when they're struggling in this work, and give them time and space to learn lots of different things that they could do in those self-care activities. And then another thing we can do as supervisors is pinpoint where some of those really stressful experiences are within our daily work and focus a lot of attention and support on those. In my experience, in talking with programs here in Colorado, a lot of the really stressful situations come from working with survivors who are dealing with mental health issues and working with survivors who are using substances. Right? Those two situations, because there's a lack of broader community support, right? So especially our programs in rural communities may not have detox or substance use programs nearby, or there are other challenges. There are not enough mental health resources. So a lot of times that can come back on advocates as they're trying to support survivors. They're kind of navigating both the issue that comes from the domestic violence or sexual assault, and they might be navigating. We know that mental health issues can be a part of this, and we also know that substance use is a common coping mechanism for dealing with domestic violence. And so really be curious in your organization, what is it? There is probably an issue or a topic that is stressing out a majority of your staff. How can you collect that information? How can you name that experience? How can you normalize it? And how can you provide supports around that? And obviously there is no magic answer, right? The best thing in a lot of communities would be to have, a new community mental health clinic or something like that, something that we don't necessarily have control over. So it doesn't have to be to that level, although there are a lot of programs across the state who are partnering with mental health providers in really creative ways and being a force in their community for saying this is something that's important to our community as a whole and the people we serve. So if that's part of your plan, great. Or if you're just going to talk about what advocacy skills do I need to feel safe in this, what do I do if somebody shows up to a shelter intake and they are visibly and potentially dangerously intoxicated? What do you do? And you'll have some policies in place, but even really giving people time to read and learn the policies, but then practicing some of that. Letting, if you have some long-term advocates who have dealt with situations like that before, giving some time and space for them to share that experience with new advocates. That could be a way to give somebody a leadership role. And so you're simultaneously supporting, a long-term advocate that you've had by giving them career growth within their position, and you're supporting maybe some of your newer advocates. So there are a lot of different ways that you can be creative and that you can support several different staff members within one activity. And I will also say that a lot of the challenge with this work and everything we've talked about so far is that there's not enough time for supervisors to do this, right? I mean, if you're listening to this and you thought, this is great information, but I'm already packed to the gills. My cup is already completely full. I can't add in, weekly or every other week supervision for my whole staff. Like, I don't have that capacity. And that is very real. And so we have to really assess where and how and what our priorities are. And so if turnover and burnout is impacting your organization, you may have to prioritize that over some other things. And those are difficult choices, and there's no easy answer for that. But can tell you that, if that's something you're really struggling with, that this is a valuable thing to invest in, and that all of us here at Violence Free Colorado would be happy to talk to you more in detail about, what that could look like, how that could happen within your agency. So not an easy conversation, but it's worth taking a look at your priorities, taking a look at your workload, and seeing how and what can shift so you have time and space for activities that reduce staff turnover. Because in the long run, it's going to save you money and time, right? If you are not having to retrain, half of your staff every year, that is going to impact you a lot in the long run. So it may be something that you need to focus on intensely for a period of time so that you can get some structural things in place. And then maybe, after a while, after a year, after a little bit more, you'll be able to back down the time you spend on it a little bit, but it may require some additional investment in priority shifting for the moment. So another thing I just want to put out here, this is also from the Trauma Stewardship book that I think is really helpful when we think about stress-resistant persons. So stress is going to be a part of our life, and it's going to be a part of our work, and there's just no way around that. We're never going to eliminate all of it. But these are some things that reduce the long-term impacts of stress and secondary trauma, and those are a sense of personal control, pursuit of personally meaningful tasks, healthy lifestyle choices, and social support. And all of these things can be built into the work that advocates are doing. Making sure that advocates know how and when they have decision-making authority in certain situations can really give people a sense of personal control. Spending time in supervision learning about what are personally meaningful tasks for some people. It could be as simple as you've got two staff folks who work in shelter, and one finds working with children very personally meaningful, and the other one finds leading house meetings personally meaningful, and they just need to switch those roles. So, one of them gets to lead house meetings, and the other one is, with the children while their parents are in house meeting. It could be just some minor shuffling when and how you can do that within a grant. So asking staff to be aware and start thinking about and learning what's personally meaningful for them, and then being able to execute some of that can really make your workplace a place that folks want to be long term. Healthy lifestyle choices, this is something that is different for everybody, right? But there are simple things that you can do. Protecting people's lunch breaks, right? I'll tell you that this is something that I tried and failed at a lot as a shelter manager, but that I still think is really important. Do people have, half an hour every day where they can be removed from the need to do direct service work and have a lunch? Do they have, what other healthy lifestyle choices do they want to make, and how do you support those within your agency? And of course, healthy is different for everybody. Everybody gets to decide what those healthy lifestyle choices are for them. But again, get to know folks, have them learn and investigate what their own needs are, and then think about how you can work that into their work. And social support. Man, this is so important. Having time where staff can, even just a little bit of time where staff can socialize together can be really powerful in building relationships. In domestic violence, I feel like even more than in a lot of other fields, domestic violence and sexual assault advocates need to be able to trust on their colleagues to support them in challenging situations. And when folks have spent time together in low stress, low stakes situations, at a staff root beer float party, or a staff walking break, or whatever it is that folks want to do together, that can really pay off when folks are in difficult situations dealing with crisis. They will have those relationships to go back to. And then thinking about turnover and burnout are like a part of this larger work that we're doing as advocates for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And, you know, this larger work of building safe communities, right? And so a couple of things to remember when you're thinking about that. So all of those things that we talked about, experiencing trauma, either secondary or primary trauma, folks who are dealing with multiple different kinds of oppression, such as racism or homophobia or those other different forms of oppression, are dealing with additional forms of trauma on top of the, you know, the trauma that a lot of folks experience in their life and or the secondary trauma they're experiencing in their work. And so, you know, we want to be really aware of how that's impacting our staff and also how that's impacting survivors. You know, that's something that may come up while they're utilizing your services. And a plug that if you're a DVP funded program and you haven't selected an ACRITY goal yet as part of their outcome number 5, that you can pick a goal that's related to staff turnover and burnout, right? That's that trauma-informed care piece of it, that you can pick supervisory ideas, things like that. That could be your goal. So if you are feeling like you are so full, you have so much to do, you have so many grant goals to do, you don't know where to start, if you're DVP funded, you're going to have to pick a goal in that area anyways. You're required to do that. So you might as well pick something. If you want to work on this issue, pick something related to that. And that can be a first step for you to make some space for this work in your day-to-day life. When you're doing work, when you're making your programs and services accessible, when you're making them culturally specific or culturally relevant, when you're making them trauma-informed, all of those things, not only do they have an impact on the people you're serving, they have an impact on your staff too, right? When folks feel like their experiences are being represented, respected, valued within the workplace, even if that's with the survivors directly, that trickles out into the work, right? That makes the work day, that makes the experiences better for the employees as well as the survivors. And so you can draw this connection, and the more you focus on that goal, the more that's going to help you kind of reduce that turnover and that burnout. So, quick plug. We are offering a free training for Violence Free Colorado members and for domestic violence program funded agencies. That is, in essence, a train the trainer for folks who are providing training in your organization. So our goal with this is to build programs capacity to do training. It's so important, but oftentimes it gets put on top of somebody else who already is doing a lot of different things. So we're hoping to offer you lesson plans and skills and tools and activities so that you have some things that you can build on and some customizable things that you can make work for your own program. So registration is open for that, and we do have some limited travel reimbursement support for programs who are coming to Denver. So click on the link here or email me if you have any other questions about that. And so I will send these resources out. These are a lot of articles and some things that I've mentioned on here if you want to dig more into this issue or share more resources with the staff that you're working with. So at this point, I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions. You can put them in the chat box. Okay, yes, I think that's working. So yeah, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat box. Also, if you want to talk individually, I am more than happy to talk with you about anything in this or anything else for that matter. So please feel free to reach out to me. My phone and email are here. I'd love to support you in the work that you're doing with programs. So I'm not seeing any questions. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.